From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editor-in-chief. On today's program, we'll be talking about the Biden administration's push to reach a normalization accord between Saudi Arabia and Israel, an issue that's been the focus of considerable media speculation over the past few months. While there are plenty of potential hurdles to reaching a deal, including Saudi Arabia's steep demands, Israel's far-right government, and challenging domestic politics here in the U.S., if done right, the potential geopolitical ramifications could be substantial. You can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. To discuss this timely and important issue, I'm joined today by three great guests: Martin Indyk, Sanam Vakil, and Bilal Saab. Martin Indyk is the Lowy Distinguished Fellow in U.S. Middle East Diplomacy at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. He was previously the Executive Vice President of the Brookings Institution, President Barack Obama's Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian Negotiations, and the U.S. Ambassador to Israel, twice, among other roles. He's also the author of several books, including, most recently, Master of the Game, Henry Kissinger and the Art of Middle East Diplomacy. Sanam Vakil is the director of the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House in London. She was previously the program's deputy director and senior research fellow, and led project work on Iran and Gulf Arab dynamics. She's also the James Anderson Professorial Lecturer in the Middle East Studies Department at Johns Hopkins SAIS Europe in Bologna, Italy. Bilal Saab is a senior fellow and director of the Defense and Security Program at MEI. He's also an associate fellow with Chatham House in London and the Assam Farris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut, an adjunct professor with Georgetown University's Security Studies Program, and the author of Rebuilding Arab Defense, U.S. Security Cooperation in the Middle East, as well as a recent policy brief for MEI on Saudi Arabia's deterrence options against Iran. Martin, Sanam, Bilal, welcome to the program, and thank you all for joining us.
Good to be with you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Alistair.
Bilal, let's dive right in. There's been considerable media speculation about a potential normalization deal, but press reports and official statements seem to be very much at odds about where things actually stand. What do we know about the current state of play?
Well, you're right, Alistair. I think there's some sort of disconnect between what the media is saying and, to be more specific, what Axios and the Wall Street Journal are saying and what the administration is saying. So it can be a little bit confusing. Frankly, I would start with the commander-in-chief because he's the most important player in this equation. I can't get in President Biden's head, but I can listen to his own words to better understand what he's thinking. And I think his words have appeared, at least in a couple of recent interviews, one with Fareed Zakaria on CNN and one with Tom Friedman with the New York Times. And if you take a look at both interviews, you can just feel that Biden's quite hesitant about accepting Saudi Arabia's price for normalizing with Israel. And I know we're going to talk about that price later. And he calls this discussion premature. So, it's on the one hand. On the other, he did dispatch his chief diplomat and his national security advisor twice to Saudi Arabia in recent weeks and months to meet with MBS and see what's possible. So just because of that, you can say that Biden is actually seriously weighing his options. And then the Wall Street Journal reported just a couple of weeks ago that the United States and Saudi Arabia already agreed on the broad contours of a deal, which, by the way, the White House immediately denied. And then Axios reported that Biden might meet with MBS on the sidelines of the G20 summit in New Delhi next month. So, look, long story short, the only conclusion we can draw from this is that at least there is serious diplomatic activity between the Saudis and the Americans. There's also mutual interest in getting this done. So motive, check. Effort, check. Now it's a matter of how do you get to yes.
And the potential for a Saudi-Israeli normalization deal has been a topic of discussion for the past several years, ever since the signing of the Abraham Accords back in the fall of 2020. Why has the Biden administration decided to make a sustained push on this front now?
I think the critical moment came when Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, told President Biden's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, that he is ready to do the deal now and would like to have the deal concluded before the election season gets underway in full force in the spring of next year. So he's made it clear that he's ready to move, that he has a sense of urgency about it, that he's ready to do it with President Biden. I think the reasoning behind this decision of his is that if he waits till after the presidential elections and there should be a Republican president, he'll have a much harder time getting the key thing that he's aiming for, which is a defense treaty that has 67 senators ratifying it. That if it's a Republican president, the Democrats, especially if it's Donald Trump, the Democrats will all vote against it and he'll have lost his chance. So he feels it's better to go with President Biden, who can bring the Democrats with him, and he believes the Republicans will be on board anyway.
Sanam, all of this comes against the backdrop of countervailing trends within the region. On the one hand, ongoing tensions and conflicts in countries like Libya and Sudan, and on the other, a clear move toward de-escalation and rapprochement in the GCC between Turkey and a number of regional states, and most prominently between Iran and Saudi Arabia. How does the current regional context shape the prospects for normalization?
It is a definitely very dynamic scene in the Middle East today. Indeed, you've mentioned the ongoing conflicts in Libya and Sudan. I would say Syria is still a conflict, as is Yemen, but there has been a shift, and that shift is also coming from Saudi Arabia away from policies that were a bit more erratic and much more activist towards deconfliction, de-escalation, and reconciliation around the region. We've watched Saudi Arabia lead the charge in renewing ties with Qatar after the 4-year blockade in 2021. There has been a massive effort to try to bring the war in Yemen to an end. Those discussions are still underway. Saudi Arabia and Iran formally have resumed diplomatic ties after quite a standoff. There has been renewal of ties also with Turkey, outreach and integration of the Assad regime back to the Arab League. And I think in the context of this de-escalation, this is where normalization with Israel also fits in. Saudi Arabia is pursuing more global reorientation. It's seeking to achieve Vision 2030 that it launched 7.5 years ago. And in order to prioritize a diversified economy in a post-hydrocarbon world, and in order to integrate the Saudi economy beyond the region into broader international markets, Saudi Arabia needs peace in the Middle East. It needs to halt attacks coming from the Houthis. It needs to stem any drone and missile attacks, also potentially coming from Iran. And you might all remember that in 2019, Iran was behind the very brazen attacks on Saudi oil fields in September of that year. So this shift is part of a recalibration that has a deep economic and domestic dynamic behind it. The kingdom needs to attract foreign capital. It needs to attract talent to drive this economic growth. It also needs tourism in order to be part of this sort of diversified economy. So this is what's behind the normalization. And it is also, finally, I will say, very much tied to Saudi dilemma of security and insecurity. It has long hinged its security relationship to the United States. And this is not a new narrative or story, but has felt very frustrated over past 3 administrations that the US is pivoting or shifting its posture away from the Middle East. And so normalization with Israel is also about hinging security to the United States as well.
Next, I want to take a closer look at the 3 key actors involved in this process, along with their respective objectives and constraints. Sanam, let's start with Saudi Arabia. You just touched on some of these points now, but I want to delve into it in a little bit more detail. According to media reports, Riyadh has laid out a number of conditions for normalizing ties: a U.S. security guarantee, advanced weapons sales, assistance with the Saudi civilian nuclear program, including potentially domestic enrichment of uranium, along with some sort of as yet to be determined concessions on the Palestinian front. What's the kingdom trying to achieve here, and how feasible do you think some of these demands really are?
That's, I think, the crux of the issue that we're trying to discuss here. The Saudi system right now is trying to achieve a lot. I think ultimately the kingdom, at least from a defense perspective, still struggles with its security dilemma in the region. It isn't able to independently assert itself in a long-standing sort of conflict or tension that it has with Iran. It has faced direct attacks from the Islamic Republic, as I mentioned previously in 2019. But Iran has, through its policy known as forward defense, supported hybrid actors around the region and particularly has developed strong ties with the Houthis that sit on Saudi Arabia's border. So, in order to manage the larger existential threat of Iran's role in the region, Saudi Arabia is looking for a security guarantee from the United States, but also to upgrade its capacity and invest in further weapons sales to maintain superiority and supremacy in the region. It also comes at a time where, of course, Iran's nuclear program is advancing without significant oversight and with no JCPOA in place. And finally, as part of this, it recognizes that stronger ties with Israel would improve Saudi Arabia's standing, perhaps in Washington. And this is something that the Emiratis have sort of paved the way in the Abraham Accords. So in order to tick off a number of these boxes, this is where normalization becomes interesting. But what is missing from the conversation, I think, in looking at this potential hat trick, as I heard someone recently describe it, is a real meaningful discussion on what Saudi Arabia can achieve and what sort of concessions could be on the table from the Israelis on the issue of Palestine, because Saudi Arabia still carries some weight in the region as the custodian of two holy mosques. It's, the largest, most important country member of the G20, and its population does have deeper ties and stronger connectivity to the issue of Palestine. And it is really unclear what concessions are on the table, what Saudi Arabia would ask for, and then, of course, the knock-on effect is where and how would Israel compromise, if at all.
Martin, the potential political, economic, and security benefits of normalizing relations with Saudi Arabia seem fairly clear for Israel, not to mention the boost it would give Netanyahu's own domestic political fortunes. But Saudi Arabia's demands are pretty significant. Where is and isn't the current Israeli government prepared to compromise, and what demands has it made of its own?
Well, I think the judgment is still reserved until it becomes clear what exactly the Biden administration is ready to do with and for Saudi Arabia. When it comes to the defense treaty, Prime Minister Netanyahu has made it clear that he supports the United States providing that kind of security assurance to Saudi Arabia. And he's made it clear that he will support it on Capitol Hill as well, where Israel has considerable influence. But on the other elements, I think that he wants to understand what's involved. A nuclear enrichment facility, which Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is insisting on for Saudi Arabia, is something that Netanyahu strongly and bitterly opposed when it came to the United States agreeing that Iran should have a heavily safeguarded enrichment capacity. The idea that Saudi Arabia should have one really opens the Pandora's box, because the assumption in Jerusalem, and I think it's not an unreasonable one, is that Egypt will want one, the United Arab Emirates, which agreed its 123 agreement never to get enrichment capabilities of its own, will want to renegotiate its agreement with the United States. Turkey might well want to have this enrichment capability as well. So it could be a very dangerous proliferation process that is sparked by that Saudi demand. So I think that the Israelis are going to want to look at what the safeguards are and what the arrangements are to ensure that down the road, if Mohammed bin Salman, or should it be some other Saudi leader, decides to renege on the deal, that he won't have an independent, unsafeguarded enrichment capability with which he could get the material necessary to make a nuclear weapon. When it comes to arms sales, which are also part of this deal, again, it's not exactly clear what the United States will agree to. The Saudis want F-35s and THAAD. There it's a question of, giving Israel reassurances and compensation to ensure that its qualitative military edge will be preserved. Since the United States has a long-time commitment to maintaining that QME, as it's referred to, I think that the Israelis and Americans will find a way to sort that out. So the heart of the matter really for Netanyahu, I think, is the nuclear enrichment capability that Mohammed bin Salman is insisting on.
Bilal, finally, what about the US? What are Washington's aims in trying to advance this deal, and what do you see as the key hurdles here?
I think there's a political aim and then there's a broader strategic aim. Politically, Biden wants to score a huge foreign policy win that could overshadow his predecessor's Abraham Accords. He's hoping that with that kind of success overseas under his belt, it could boost his reelection campaign. Although, frankly, I don't know how big of a deal foreign policy or the Middle East is for the American voter. But that said, there is some interconnectedness. If the United States has the Saudis in its corner, they will ideally cooperate on what we care about the most, which is oil production, in the sense that they would increase their oil production, which should reduce the price of gas in the United States, which is a big deal for an American voter who is struggling with this debilitating inflation. I mean, heck, I filled up my car the other day with $4 a gallon. So we're back to higher gas prices. So, as always, foreign policy starts at home. Strategically, if Washington can deny China deeper access into Saudi Arabia, that's a considerable achievement that will be quite helpful for America's top foreign policy priority. As far as the key hurdles, Sanam has mentioned a few, and I agree with her. Definitely a huge concern over the issue of nuclear proliferation if we are to assist the Saudis with creating a civilian nuclear program, because we all very much know that it is not much of a difficult effort to switch from civilian to a weaponized program. That's the problem with, these kinds of endeavors. Not that we don't trust the Saudis, but we certainly fear that if they were to switch, that would lead to nuclear proliferation, and certainly that would destabilize the entire region. Obviously, it would depend on what the Iranians do with their own program, but just having that option in the hands of the Saudis certainly is a concern for us. Then the issue of the defense pact. So we're going to give a defense pact to the Saudis and not to Taiwan, our top foreign policy priority in the Indo-Pacific, or to Kiev, which is fighting for freedom and for transatlantic security. This is a tough sell. And it's also a huge military commitment. Let's, not understate how much this would require of us in terms of deployment of additional military assets in order to support that kind of commitment that would be legal in nature. And boy, would I expect the Iranians to come test us at every moment if we are to extend official security guarantees to the kingdom. Because the way they've done it, which they've done it for a long time, is they operate below the threshold of warfare and they operate in the gray zone. So at that point, if they were to still challenge or threaten the Saudis using those tactics, do we respond? If they operate through surrogates, which they've also done for a long time, through non-state actors, whether it's the Houthis or any other actor in the region, whether it's in Iraq or elsewhere that can threaten the Saudis, and that they use Iranian weapons, do we respond against Iran or do we respond against those non-state actors? So I think it's an extremely complex problem set that I bet you the Pentagon is not excited about, and the broader US national security community. And then my last point about hurdles is I think extending a defense pact to the Saudis would impede, if not hinder, the critical necessity of defense reforms on the part of the Saudis. If we were to extend something like that to them, I don't think that their incentive to overhaul their defense enterprise would be as strong as it is now. I think it would also be quite inconsistent with what CENTCOM is trying to do in the region, which is to promote greater multilateralism and to institute a revamped approach to security cooperation that asks these regional partners to step up and to contribute a lot more meaningfully to regional security. The moment you provide them with a defense pact, that's it. This is when they become complacent. This is when they really become a lot more dependent on the United States, which is precisely what we're trying to avoid. For a long period of time, we were the protectors of the Saudis. We were playing the guardianship role. If we were to do this again today, we are not going to be cultivating an effective and responsible partner in the Saudis. So all of those hurdles, all of these concerns, believe me, are on the minds of top Pentagon officials.
Now that we've laid out all of the conditions and constraints, I want to take a step back and ask each of you how you assess the deal as currently envisioned. Martin, let's start with you. Does this deal make sense, and what impact do you think it would have?
Well, it's a complicated deal. It stands and falls on whether a two-thirds majority of the Senate will agree to commit the United States to treat an attack on Saudi Arabia by a state actor as an attack on the United States. That's a pretty tall order, given that the American public is not really interested in getting involved in another war in the Middle East. And given the fact that Saudi Arabia is not exactly the flavor of the month in Washington or on the Hill, not only because of its behavior when it comes to human rights, but its war in Yemen, its blockade of Qatar, a range of actions that the Saudi Crown Prince has taken, which has raised real concerns about the logic of committing the United States forever to an Article 5 NATO-like defense commitment with what is, of course, an authoritarian government, not a democratic government. So there's that dimension of it that's problematic. And as I said, without it, the deal fails. The Crown Prince is not prepared to go ahead with peace with Israel unless he has that defense treaty with the United States. The other dimension of it that's very complicated and I think highly problematic is that the Israeli government is a far-right coalition government with extremists in it like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, who are pursuing very aggressive, racist, homophobic policies that are particularly focused on establishing a de facto and, where possible, a de jure annexation of the West Bank. And if this deal with Saudi Arabia does not curb their ambitions in the West Bank through preventing further expansion of Israeli settlements, preventing the legalization of illegal outposts, and through the transfer of territory from Israeli control in the West Bank to the Palestinian Authority, if that's not part of the deal, if this turns out to be a great victory for far-right extremist policies of this Israeli government, then far from advancing peace, what the deal will have done will have been to put an end to the potential for Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation. And all of that's before you get to the way in which this can impact the efforts by almost half of Israel's population, many of whom are out on the streets every week for the last 33 weeks, protesting the Netanyahu government's efforts to undermine and curb the influence of the independent judiciary and undermine Israel's democracy. If this deal gives this far-right government a turbo boost, then that will also be taken as a green light by them to push ahead with their judicial reforms that will fundamentally change the nature of Israel's democracy in a negative way. So President Biden, as he pushes this deal forward, has got to figure out a way to do this that doesn't give a victory to Netanyahu's far-right government, that doesn't give a boost to the anti-democratic forces in Israel, and that doesn't green light the intentions of the ultra-nationalists in Netanyahu's government to take over the West Bank in whole.
In a recent New York Times column, Thomas Friedman speculated that this deal might reshape the Israeli political landscape and suggesting that it kind of might be enough of an incentive to force Netanyahu to move towards the center and perhaps even abandon some of those current coalition partners you were just speaking about. How plausible do you think a scenario like that actually is?
Well, it's plausible if President Biden insists on it. In other words, if President Biden presents Netanyahu with a choice between achieving peace and maintaining his far right government, then the dilemma is Netanyahu's and he will have to make a decision. And it's possible that he could seek an alternative coalition that would be supportive from parties in the opposition, like Benny Gantz's National Unity Party or Yair Lapid's Yesh Atid Party. Whether they would join is another thing, or they might support it from the outside. But if Netanyahu is not willing to meet American requirements when it comes to a significant Palestinian component of this deal, and instead is able to go ahead while maintaining his coalition with these far-right extremists, then the deal will look very problematic in terms of Israel's future as a democracy and Israel's future relationship with the Palestinians. It's in President Biden's hands to put that question to Netanyahu, to essentially say, look, you can have peace with Saudi Arabia and what will flow on from that in terms of relations with the Muslim world, not just the Arab world. Or you can maintain the policies that your far-right, crazy far-right government is pursuing when it comes to Israel's democracy and when it comes to the West Bank. But you can't have both, and leave it up to Netanyahu to figure out whether he can rearrange things in a way that makes it possible for him to embrace the deal. Or if he can't, then to go for something less ambitious, that doesn't have the negative and dangerous effects of a deal that would give a turbo boost to the far-right government in Israel.
Sanam, what's your perspective? How do you view the deal and its potential impact, both for the parties involved and on the broader regional landscape?
So, in terms of the impact, I think the deal as it stands is quite far fetched and I think quite far away in terms of achievements. President Biden is about to enter a very contested election cycle. I think that the Biden administration probably began to invest in this deal a bit too late to deliver it in the short timeline that's ahead. Also, the ask on the table and the conditions that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia have outlined are so high and so impossible to deliver in a quick timeline that for this to be achieved, it's going to require time, negotiations, and leadership that also is missing on the Israeli side. So if this comes to fruition, it will take some time. And personally, I think for this deal to be delivered properly and to have the impact that the US government and the Saudi government are seeking, which is to stabilize the region, use integration with Israel as an opportunity to bolster regional security, it requires real concessions and a real reinvigoration of the two-state process, which is currently not being discussed. So I tend to be pessimistic in the short term, but perhaps with time and real leadership and dedication, it can get off the ground.
Quick follow up question for you as well, Sanam. How is this being viewed in Iran, and what impact do you think it might have on Tehran's strategic thinking and its own normalization with Riyadh?
Well, I think that Tehran feels that it has sort of trumped Saudi Israeli normalization and jumped the queue in signing its normalization deal with Riyadh in March of this year, brokered by the Chinese. I think Tehran had many motivations to finally normalize ties with Riyadh. It's something that has been on the table and had been discussed in regional forums brokered by the Iraqis and the Omanis for quite some time. Iran was, however, looking to stabilize its domestic landscape after months of protests. Iran is, of course, in need of economic off ramps. It remains under maximum pressure sanctions. And it is looking to limit Israeli integration in the region and has for over 6 years now been looking to restore diplomatic ties across the GCC. And with its reconciliation with Saudi Arabia, it has ticked all of those boxes. Iran has some red lines. I mean, it recognizes and it has long known that the UAE and Saudi Arabia and other GCC states do have quiet intelligence and security ties with the Israelis. But for Iran, the red line is having Israeli military presence in the Persian Gulf. And so it will be looking to assert that going forward. I would just raise also a sort of tactical difference in strategies between Israel and, let's say, the GCC states. And I think Saudi Arabia should be included here vis a vis Iran. While they perhaps might all see Iran as a regional threat, tactically, the Gulf states are not looking to provoke Iran. They're looking to diplomatically engage and manage their relationship with Iran. Whereas, of course, Israel's octopus strategy has been much more aggressive, also attacking Iranian nuclear facilities inside Iranian territory. And what the kingdom fears, alongside the other GCC states, is that a war between Israel and Iran will drag the GCC in. And so they're looking to stem the spillover effects of any potential conflict.
Sanam, you touched on the March 2023 China brokered Iran Saudi agreement just now. It's hard to avoid viewing this whole Israel Saudi normalization process in the context of that and China's growing role in the region more broadly. In your view, how much would this deal actually do to contain China within the region?
Sitting where I sit in London, we have a bit more of a nuanced view of how China is engaging in the region and what regional states are seeking from China and Russia. And I think you could very simplistically divide the region between two blocks. You have countries like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, and Israel, who might be seeking to balance between the US and China and have forged stronger economic ties with China. And it's important to acknowledge that Saudi Arabia is completely energy dependent on Beijing. It is at the same time security dependent on the United States. And so the issue of balance is very important for the kingdom going forward. You do have a second block of countries in the region, let's say the adversaries, we might call them, Iran and Syria, who are looking to invite countries like China, but also Russia into the region as a counterweight to the United States. And so I don't really see normalization as stemming China's influence. We don't see at Chatham House as China stepping up or stepping into the security space in the Middle East. And our work has continued to point that China remains a free rider and is looking to perhaps build on opportunities in the region. And that exactly was the March 2023 Saudi-Iran agreement. They swanned in and brought the two sides together and pushed them over the line. The hard work had really been done before. So I think it's important to look at all of these issues in a nuanced way, to acknowledge that the region is fluid and there are many contradictions. But from Saudi's perspective, they are looking for a more balanced regional posture, and that's going to come with tensions in Washington and perhaps also tensions with Beijing that we don't really normally hear about.
Bilal, I want to get your take here as well. Do you think a U.S. brokered Saudi-Israel normalization deal would live up to the hype? And do you think this is the best way to achieve the desired aims?
I'll try not to repeat what Sanam said because I am in full agreement with her. Look, there's a lot of good in Saudi-Israeli normalization. I would welcome it if it happens, but there's no question that it will not address the fundamental issues that have plagued the Middle East for decades. And that's bad governance and Iran's predatory behavior, with the latter exacerbating the former. To the second part of your question, I wonder what desired aims you mean. So, why don't we just talk about the Saudis for a second? Is this the best way to achieve the desired Saudi aims and the U.S. aims because they're interconnected? No, I don't think so. I'm on the record saying multiple times that the president's instinct on reconciling with Saudi Arabia is spot on. It's fine. But I don't think he has the wrong idea. This normalization deal, I don't think it should be predicated on a U.S. Saudi defense pact, which I don't believe is going to effectively upgrade U.S. Saudi security ties. And it will obligate us to commit more military resources to the Middle East when we should be focused on preventing the Chinese from seizing Taiwan and on countering Russia and Ukraine. So I am against providing Saudi Arabia with formal security guarantees, which means that we're going to elevate the relationship to a treaty alliance, only because there are just better ways to effectively address the core concern of the Saudis, which is stronger defenses against Iranian aggression. If we do this without instituting more effective security cooperation with the Saudis, it really will make no practical difference. This wholly top down approach to a more strategic US Saudi defense arrangement, as I mentioned before, also, it just could be an excuse to delay or evade the hard but necessary defense reforms that both sides should make to truly, genuinely elevate the security relationship. The Saudi national defense, the goal of Saudi national defense should no longer be our responsibility alone. This US Saudi oil for security covenant, that expired the moment Saddam Hussein was defeated by the US military in the sands of the Kuwaiti desert in 1991. So today, this, and for the future, this should be a joint mission in which the Saudis have real ownership and they make serious contributions. So, no, we don't need a defense pact. That means little intangible joint combat power. I would love to see, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people will disagree, a full-fledged U.S. involvement in the kingdom's defense reform effort to attain a more coordinated approach to security. That would include some things like joint US Saudi contingency planning, which we do very well with the Israelis. So there's no reason why we shouldn't be doing it with the Saudis, or we can't be doing it with the Saudis. Further investments in institutional capacity building. So not just equipment, but also instituting processes, norms, procedures that would make up a healthy defense foundation. That's what real security partners do. They collaborate on both the details, but also the big picture of joint defense. That's what I want to see. I don't want to see a defense pact that's not going to mean a whole lot in practical, again, joint combat power.
Following up on that, too, I think it also seems to go against everything that the administration itself has laid out under the national security strategy, namely having regional partners do more, as well as the potential for kind of unintended consequences. I think you touched on this a little bit earlier, but what does this mean for all the other key U.S. partners that currently don't have a security guarantee? Are we looking at a potential kind of domino effect?
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, do you expect Abu Dhabi to be happy with this, or the Israelis? I mean, the Israelis, we don't have a defense pact with the Israelis. There might be some secret documents there, that suggest that we would definitely support them in the event of a war. And obviously we did that in the past. But there's nothing that legally commits us to supporting the Israelis. And now all of a sudden we're going to provide that to the Saudis? I bet you that the Israelis are going to be asking about the same exact thing from us if we were to give this to the Saudis. And the Emiratis. I mean, the Emiratis have been asking for this way before the Saudis, and we have yet to provide them with an answer. And I don't think we will provide them with an answer. So is there a possibility for a domino effect? Yes, of course. Egyptians also will ask. The Qataris, forward headquarters of CENTCOM. This is where we have the biggest military presence in the region, in Qatar, and we're not going to provide them with a defense pact. So look, I don't think we can isolate this. I don't think we could just pick the Saudis and tell the others that, sorry, we're not in a position to provide you with the defense pact. So there's a diplomatic component to this negotiation, which I really hope that the White House has thought about very carefully. As you talk about unintended consequences, Alistair, that's just one of them. And then, of course, the second one, at least in theory, yes, vastly inconsistent, as I mentioned before, with this instinct and approach of incentivizing those regional partners to do more. If I'm going to provide you with top cover, I'm not going to expect the Saudis to do a whole lot more. And that's just plain logic. And the fact that they, don't have much of a record of actually contributing meaningfully to regional security. So that process will probably come to a halt the moment we provide them with that kind of official security guarantees. Now, look, in theory, you could have both. Yes, it's possible. Yes, you could still incentivize them to contribute more. But in reality, I just don't see that happening, honestly. And so you're going to have to accept that cost. If the administration is going to move forward with this, you're going to have to accept that cost and admit that it's vastly inconsistent with the priorities of the national defense strategy, which is incentivizing these countries to basically work together with us to contribute a whole lot more to regional security and play a much more positive role. So, I hope that the administration has a plan for all these unintended consequences, which are not easy to address. And they're extremely, I would say, antithetical to what we're trying to do in the Middle East, but also globally.
We're running short on time here, but before we wrap up, I want to get all of your outlooks. No one has a crystal ball, of course, but how do you see things playing out moving forward? Sanam, let's start with you.
I think that things are going to move slowly, despite the momentum and despite the sort of suggestion that there will be a lot of meetings going forward in the fall. I don't expect a quick win, and that's because of domestic tensions in Israel and the ability to deliver anything meaningful on Palestine. And I'm actually a bit cautious on this deal because the last time the international community in the region supported an outside in sort of peace arrangement, it neglected the interests of the Palestinians. And that is just going to open up yet another opportunity for instability in Israel and in Palestine, but also it will provide an opportunity for spoiler states such as the Islamic Republic to take advantage of conflict and put pressure on Israel.
Martin, what's your read?
I think the next 6 months are going to be critical and decisive. We'll have to see what the actual deal between the United States and Saudi Arabia works out to be. I think that's probably the least problematic part of the deal. We'll have to see what the Senate will insist upon before it gives its 2/3 vote for a defense treaty, if it does at all. And we'll have to see what President Biden insists upon with the Netanyahu government and what the Netanyahu government is prepared to do. All of these things are at this point unpredictable. Put them all together and it makes it a long shot. But the fact that you have an Arab leader, an Israeli leader, and an American leader who are all trying to put this deal together means that it remains possible, and if it can be done in the right way, it would be a huge and strategic breakthrough for the Middle East and for the United States in the Middle East.
Bilal, what's your take?
Yeah, I'm with Sanam on this being a gradual approach, and this might take some time before it actually materializes in a way. We don't even know if it's actually going to materialize. This whole issue of the Senate actually agreeing to a treaty alliance with Saudi Arabia, it's so difficult to imagine. But let me assume that we are in that place and the administration made a political case, the Republicans are behind it. I just don't know where the Saudi mindset is and the Saudi appetite is for negotiation. I mean, are these things that they're asking for binary, or is there room for negotiation? And what I mean by that is, okay, so they want help on a domestic civilian nuclear program. Is there room for something less than that? Is there an opportunity to institute a 1-2-3 agreement like we have with the UAE, where they don't enrich their own uranium on their own soil? Or do they actually want the full-fledged thing on their own soil and then just have American companies help them with that? I don't know where the Saudis are on that. Same thing with the defense pact. Like, it's binary. It's either yes or no. Do they just want a defense pact, or can we work with them on something less legalistic, less formal, but definitely enhanced security cooperation, which is actually what I'm calling for, right? So depending on where the Saudi mindset is how this process is going to go forward, in my opinion, because I just do not see us coming together as a country, as a Congress, as a White House, as a Pentagon, agreeing to a defense pact with the Saudis, given all the consequences that we discussed today and the unintended, implications of this. So, is this a negotiating tactic on the part of the Saudis? Like, we'll ask for the best deal, and then if we get something a little bit less, that's fine. Or are they really firm on that price? I don't know the answer to that, but that's, to me, a determining factor on how things are going to move forward.
We'll have to leave things there for now, but Martin, Sanam, Bilal, thank you all very much for joining us today. That's all the time we have for this week. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in, and to our production team for all of their work on this week's episode. You can find the latest coverage of key regional issues like the Saudi-Israel normalization process on our website at www.mei.edu. And you can follow MEI on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.